Okay, some of them say yes. Okay, perfect. So first of all, thank you very much for having me to this conference. In many ways, this is the first. So it's the first time I'm sitting at a presentation. It's the first time I'm doing this online. It's the first time I'm doing this as a father. So it's very exciting to do that today. And the paper I'm going to present is joint work with Milan Klus, Todor Lovas, and Armin Schwienbacher. And we run a study on how banks interact with FinTechs. So let me start right away with how the paper was actually motivated in the first place. So we started this study a couple of years ago, actually. And at the time, what we observed was that the financial industry spent large amounts of money on financial technology or information technology. And at the time, not a lot of people talked about fintech. It was just an observation that a lot of money has been spent on IT and finance. And what we also saw was that banks were perceived as least innovative by most of the customers they had. And then what happened at the time was that we saw that fintechs actually reshaped or crowded out a lot of the business that banks were doing, and these new participants appeared on the market. And a lot of talk was about whether fintechs would actually crowd out banks or whether they would collaborate or not. And we thought that would be a neat idea to actually see whether they engage in strategic alliances with these newcomers and new players on the market. So this is what we actually did. So we run a study, and we were mostly interested on the extent on how banks are interacting with fintechs. So how much interaction is going on right now? What are the different forms of interactions they engage in? So are they collaborating on a product collaboration basis, or are they actually investing in these fintech companies? Then the question obviously is what actually drives these strategic alliances between fintechs and banks. And finally, we also wanted to know what the impact of these alliances is. And obviously, it would have been nice to know whether an alliance with the bank would increase firm value in terms of return on assets or something like that. But at the time, we didn't believe that this would be feasible because the alliances were so small, and we didn't believe that there would be any impact. For that reason, we run an event study to see the impact. So in economics, by now, it has become a tradition to first present the findings to you. So in case you need to grab a coffee here at the online conference, so you at least get the results, and then you can grab your coffee and then you know what's in the paper. And so what we find is that, first of all, if a bank implemented a digitalization strategy or employed a chief digital officer, what we see is that there's a positive effect on the number of alliances with fintechs. We also see that larger banks are more willing to engage financially with fintechs. And if banks engage financially in a fintech, they often buy small fintechs. And finally, what we see is running the event study. If a bank announces to engage in an alliance with a fintech, then this has a negative effect on bank value, except for the fact if it's a digital bank, they are benefiting to some extent from an alliance. Okay. Now the slides are not moving on. Oh, no, they do. Okay, so here's a brief wrap up of the literature. So what we have seen so far is mostly there have been papers on specific topics in fintech. So mostly people have written about crowdfunding or blockchain or payment systems or something like that. But there has been little research on fintech in general, in a sense that a couple of people wrote about a categorization of the industry. For instance, Thomas Puschmann in Zurich came up with this categorization. Kristin and I had a paper on what determines fintech formations around the world. Doug and Armin have a paper on the financing of fintechs via venture capital around the world. And then there is a paper by Navarrete actually looking conceptually at bank fintech alliances, but they didn't do this empirically, and they also didn't check the extent of these alliances that have occurred so far. So let me jump right into our hypothesis. So in the first step, what we would say is that, in line with Coase and others that have followed him, alliances must be the result of a mutual beneficial transaction between the banks and the fintechs. If it weren't the case, then they would actually not do, or they shouldn't do it. And starting from this, we have derived 3 hypotheses. So the first is, if the bank has a CDO or a digitalization strategy, we would expect that these banks are actually engaging more often in alliance with the fintech. And this hypothesis is not quite clear, I would say, because it could also be the other way around, right? I mean, if you have a CDO who is responsible for setting up a digitalization strategy, or who's responsible for digitalizing the bank, he could actually, or she could actually decide whether to do this in-house and not via a corporation. And as I will tell you later, we will see that a CDO has a positive effect, but we also see that a lot of banks are stopping these corporations at some time, and they might even also develop their own solutions for the bank. Then what we would say is that larger banks are more likely to acquire fintechs, while smaller banks engage in product-related cooperation. Why is that the case? Well, first of all, it's not clear for a bank which fintech they should actually buy. And they could easily make a mistake in buying the wrong fintech. And what will happen is, if they buy the wrong fintech, a competitor might buy the right fintech. And so they are stuck with the wrong technical solution, and they just bet on the wrong horse. So, but larger banks have deeper pockets. So what they can do is they can actually buy more fintechs and make more acquisitions, by more minority shares, because they're just financially capable of doing so. And smaller banks, what we observe, are often more specialized, and what they do is they engage in what is called API banking, or banking as a platform, or banking as a service. So they engage more often in product-related corporations, and they try to benefit from the business model of the fintech in that way. We also believe, in line with Aguillon and Bolton, that banks are more likely to invest in small fintechs rather than in large fintechs, because it's more difficult to contract financial innovations for small fintechs. Innovations are not that developed yet, and it's more difficult for a bank or any corporation to contract with a mere idea if you don't know what really will come out in the future. And it's easier for them to buy a share and to exercise control if they have a share in the company, and if the innovation is not that developed yet. And also, buying large fintechs might not make that much sense, because most of the distribution channels, or even the end user base, let's say the customers, might be the same. If a large bank buys a large fintech, imagine a big bank might buy PayPal, for example, then the customer base might pretty much be the same, and they wouldn't gain anything by actually acquiring such a fintech. So here comes our data and variables. And as I said, this is a long run project. We started this, I think, around in 2015. And then we started to collect data on the 100 largest banks in Canada, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. And we collected this data from 2007 to 2017. This is what mostly Milan and Toto did in a very tedious and long and exercising work. And the data is mostly hand collected. For instance, strategic alliances and CDOs were reported in the annual reports, and we had to hand collect the data from there. And at the time, it was not enough to say that we have a digital strategy. The bank had to come out or lay out a real strategy on how to digitalize in the future, and then we would actually count it as a digitalization or a digitalization strategy. We also had collected information on the fintech alliances, and what we found was, looking at the bank websites, Crunchbase, and other data sources like Factiva, that there were 500 bank and fintech alliances at the time. And now you might say, well, you just stopped at 500 and thought that would be enough, and kept the number at this size. But it was just coincidence that we had 500. So as you know, as economists or even as lawyers, 500 as a number is as likely as any other number. And so it was just by coincidence that we collected 500 bank and fintech alliances. We also collected a lot of control variables, for instance, whether the bank is listed, whether it's a universal bank or a specialized bank, what the bank's total assets are, what the return on average assets are. And this all comes from the Fitch Connect database or from annual reports, again, hand collected. So we have three variables of interest, or three dependent variables in our regressions. The first one is whether the bank has established an alliance with a fintech, yes or no. So this is a dummy variable. Then we have the number of alliances in terms of investments the bank has made. And we have the cumulative abnormal returns for a very short event window between 1 or -1 day and +1 day. And we try to explain this with a couple of explanatory variables. One of them is whether there's a CDO, whether it's a digital bank, whether the bank has a digital strategy, and what the assets of the bank are, and so on. And we also have size measures, for example, for the fintech size and for the bank size. So let me jump right into the results. Here are some summary statistics, and on the top two rows, you see that the first variable is alliances, which is a dummy variable, and it shows that because this is a panel data set, right? I mean, it's from 2007 to 2017 for 400 banks. You see that in 12% of the cases, there has been an alliances between a bank and a fintech. And then the question is, if there was an alliances, how many fintechs have there been? And the number of new alliances that have been established is 0.11, meaning that there's a very low number. So on average, a bank in a given year had 0.1 alliances with a fintech. Obviously, some of the banks had more and others had less. The variables of interest, digital strategy and chief digital officer, you can see that 21% of the time there was a digital strategy, and in only 3% of the cases, banks had a chief digital officer, but there was an obvious upward trend towards hiring such an individual. Okay, so here's some descriptives on the segments where fintechs have been active. And alliances with fintechs were mostly in the domain of payment services. This is interesting because fintechs in general were mostly established in the form of promoting financing. In our other paper, we could actually show that financing was the dominant form of what fintechs were actually operating in. And but if they collaborate with banks, we see that payment services is the most dominant form of fintech business models they engage in. In the UK, this is slightly different. In the UK, we see that they also develop quite frequently bank software. So they are building some type of background software for the banks. So here's our first regression, and the dependent variable is our dummy variable. So we run a probit regression, and I want to draw your attention to the first two variables, which we were mostly interested in. And what you can see is that if the bank had a digital strategy or a chief digital officer, you can see that it was more likely, and this is positive and statistically significant, that they actually engaged in an alliance with a fintech. And for the remaining variables, you don't see that there's anything robust except for that the bank was listed, so which could be a proxy for that it's a larger bank. A larger bank is more likely to engage in an alliance with a fintech. So in the second step, what we did was we tried to explain the number of alliances with fintechs. And this is a negative binomial regression. And I tell you how to interpret these coefficients. So what they are is pretty much a multiplicative effect, in a sense that if you had a digital strategy, for instance, in regression 1, this made it 4 times more likely, or this increased the number of alliances 4 times, while if you had a digital officer in regression 2, this increased the number of alliances by 2.7 times if you had such an individual in the board of directors. Okay, again, as you can see, our two variables of interest, digital strategy and chief digital officer, are both significant statistically and positive and large in magnitude and also pretty robust. And what we did was on the right-hand side, regression 5 to 8, we excluded the largest fintechs, because what you could say is that it's something different, right? I mean, if you're collaborating with PayPal or different big company than cooperating with a small company, which helps you to identify your customer or something like that. And so we excluded these largest fintechs, which had more than 1,000 employees or have been established for more than 10 years. And then you see that the coefficients become slightly stronger. So the effect is pretty much the same, except that the coefficients become a bit stronger than before, but the results are pretty much robust. You also see that a couple of the explanatory variables are robust and significant. For instance, whether the bank is listed, which again might be a proxy for the size of the bank, is a good predictor of the number of alliances banks have engaged in with fintechs. So the next is our deal level variable. So here we investigated whether fintechs either engage in product-related cooperations with a bank, or whether they are bought by a bank in a sense that the bank acquires a minority or majority share. And so this is a dichotomous variable. Either it's a product-related cooperation or it's acquisition by the bank. And what you see is that in the first row, for instance, financial investment dummy variable indicates that in 44% of the cases, we had a financial investment relative to a product-related cooperation in our sample. Obviously, chief digital officer and digital strategy were more prevalent in this sample because these are only observations where actually a cooperation took place. And here are the forms of alliances. And what you can see is that in most of the cases, we had product-related, whoops, oh, we went back. In most of the cases, we actually had product-related cooperation, as I mentioned before, but for some countries that was not true. For instance, in the UK, you can see that most of the time the cooperation was a minority investment and not a product-related cooperation. And the same holds for France, but apparently there's no pattern then in bank-based and in capital market-based economies. There's a trend towards the one or the other. So here is the regression on which form of alliances has been established. An independent variable is whether there is a financial investment or not. And as you can see, the digital strategy or the chief digital officer doesn't play a role in which type of alliances banks engage. But you can see that the size of the fintech plays a role. So the smaller or the larger the fintech, the less likely it becomes that banks make a financial investments. And the larger the bank, the more likely it becomes that banks make a financial investment. But this holds mostly for this full sample, not for the sample where we exclude our large fintechs. Okay, so let's move on to the event study. So here's the first descriptive statistic of the event study. And in the first two rows, what you see is the abnormal returns for event windows between -1 day and +1 day, as well as -1 day and the day of the event. And what you see here is that there's a negative and statistically significant impact of 0.5%, meaning that if a bank announces that cooperation with a fintech takes place, the capital market is actually not appreciating that, and the returns of the bank move on average down by 0.5% as compared to what could have been expected. If you look at longer event windows from 0, the event day, to 100, there is a strong positive effect of 2.9%. However, this effect is not statistically significant. So what we tried to do was in the first step that these are obviously average effects, right? I mean, a couple of banks could have a positive effect, others could have a negative effect. And the question would be, can we explain the differences? And then we run a lot of regressions, we tortured a lot of data, and the data didn't confess any sin. So what we saw that was that no matter what we do, there's no robust or any dominant effect how we could explain the abnormal returns. The only variable that is slightly significant and explains the abnormal returns if banks announce such an alliance is a digital bank. So if a digital bank announces an alliance with a fintech, then we can see some minor positive abnormal returns, and this might be an explanatory variable. So the last thing we did was we wanted to see how long these alliances actually perform and whether they perform well or not. So we contacted our sample of the 500 alliances with FinTechs and banks. And for 150, we could actually find out either by a direct response from the FinTech or the bank or information from Factiva, whether the alliances were terminated or not. And what we saw is out of this 150 alliances, in 25 cases, the alliance was indeed terminated. And the reason why it was terminated was mostly that the bank ended the cooperation. And the most common reasons named were that the bank developed its own technical solutions and didn't need the FinTech anymore. The FinTech was sold to a competitor or went insolvent. And third, the end of the contract or accelerator program by the bank terminated the alliance. And finally, the bank simply changed its strategy and it wasn't a need anymore in engaging with an alliance with a FinTech. Looking at survival charts for the CDO and digital strategy, we see that there's no difference in the survival rates of such an alliance, neither if there's a CDO nor whether there's a digital strategy. So it didn't matter whether you had a CDO on how long the alliance went. So what do we do out of this? So here's a summary of our results. First, the implementation of a digital strategy or CDO had a positive effect on alliances with FinTechs, even though by now I think it's not clear whether they did it because they just wanted to learn from the FinTech and in the end develop their own technical solution, or they want to have this collaboration for a longer period of time. We saw that banks, or in particular large banks, are more willing to engage financially with FinTechs, while banks are also more likely to invest in small FinTechs, which is in line with contracting theory. And so this has clear policy implications. So if you are a FinTech and you're looking for money, what you should do probably try to approach a large bank. But if you're more interested in collaborating with someone and entering a product base, then you should go for a smaller and more specialized bank. But the question is this the right step for the banks to do to engage in these alliances with FinTechs? And when we look at the abnormal returns, what we see is that there's a negative effect, at least in the short run. And the capital market doesn't appreciate these alliances. So apparently it's not the right thing to do for most of these banks. And so thank you very much for your attention. And in times of Corona, if you're very bored at home, feel free to have a look at these books. And I'm happy to send a copy if you want to have one.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to comment on this paper. I really enjoyed reading it, Lars, and particularly really appreciated the huge amount of work that must have gone into building such a granular hand-collected data set, which I'm sure will make a huge contribution to the literature and can be used in other projects. I've just lost my screen. Hold on. Okay, there we go. So my understanding of this project is that the motivation is really to help us understand better how banks interact with FinTech firms in circumstances where there's a paucity of good literature and particularly good empirical literature on this question. And Lars has already stepped us through the hypotheses, which essentially are firstly that banks with a CDO or a digital strategy defined as something more than just mere rhetoric, more than mere branding, are more likely to engage in alliances with FinTechs. The form of alliance, it's hypothesized, will be a product both of bank size and the size of the FinTech. So larger banks will be more likely to invest or acquire a stake rather than to engage in the more contractual product-based collaboration, while smaller banks are more likely to do the latter. And banks generally are more likely to choose to invest in smaller firms and engage in product-based contractual collaboration with larger firms, as I understand it. And then thirdly, there's another hypothesis which is tested with the event studies, and that's about the impact of announcing one of these alliances on market value. And the hypothesis here is that the public announcement of the alliance will produce a positive impact on market value. And this hypothesis is, I think, a bit of an extension of the original motivation for the project, and consistently with that, there's a different method used here than there is for exploring the first and second set of hypotheses, which use this very impressive hand-collected, very granular data set. And the results, as we've heard from Lars, are that in relation to the first hypothesis, the results are consistent with this. So there's a positive relationship between having a CDO and or a digital strategy and engaging in one of these alliances. The results, as I understand it, for the second set of hypotheses, hypotheses 2A and B, are more mixed. So I noticed in both the paper and in Lars' presentation, the headline is still there is evidence to support the hypothesis. And yet, as Lars pointed out in his presentation, and as is clear from the paper, as I understand it, the results here are being driven entirely, it seems, by those larger FinTechs. And so if we put those larger FinTechs out of the sample, if I understand it correctly, then we don't find that this is a very good explanation for the choice of form of alliance. So something else is going on here, or must be going on here, to explain a choice of alliance, but it doesn't seem to be those things that are hypothesized. So actually there's only weak support for the hypothesis, as I understand it, in the results here. And then thirdly, and very interestingly, the authors find that contrary to what they expect, announcing the alliance does not have a short-term positive impact on market value. So I just wanted to step through the questions that occurred to me on reading the paper, which should appear on the slide. And I should say that these are almost all anticipated in the final section of the paper, which sets up further questions and acknowledges some of the avenues for future research that might come out of this work. So firstly, in relation to hypothesis 1, like the authors anticipate in the last section of the paper, I do wonder about the causal relationship here. I do wonder about which is coming first, the appointment of the CDO and the digital strategy, then the alliance. That's the hypothesis. So I have a CDO or some other form of formalized digital strategy, and then I go out and I form a FinTech alliance. But intuitively, it might be equally plausible to posit that I go and form a select number of alliances in line with what is not yet a publicly formal strategy, but is an internal organizational strategy. And at some point, I gather together the evidence of this into something which I announce to the world as my formal digital strategy. And if that's right, then of course, having a CDO or having a digital strategy is not actually what's driving entry into the alliances. And I'm sort of fortified in this concern by the interesting line in the paper that says, of those banks in the sample that did enter into an alliance of these kinds, only 76% of them had a digital strategy and 15% had a CDO. So if we take that 76% that have a digital strategy, so that means 1 in 4 didn't, right, of these banks. So clearly, I mean, I'm assuming that the acquisition or the other form of alliance that they enter into isn't entered into randomly. So there must be a strategy that drives entry into an alliance in the absence of either a formal published digital strategy or a CDO. So there must be something else going on, or rather there's probably an informal strategy that motivates the FinTech alliance being formed, followed later on, I would guess, by a more public announcement of a formalized digital strategy. And so that makes me wonder about how much we can draw from this part of the results. The results in relation to hypotheses 2A and B, I think are very interesting because it seems, as I said, that they're being driven primarily by that subset of the sample, that's the larger FinTechs, which means that we don't find much support for the hypotheses in relation to FinTechs with less than 1,000 employees. So what might explain the choice of form of alliance for that other part of the sample, those with less than 1,000 employees? Well, it seems to me, as the authors acknowledge at the end of the paper, that we might need to think more about things on the FinTech side rather than on the bank side to try to work out why it is that alliances take a particular form. because the paper, as I understand it, the setup really assumes that it's banks, bank characteristics and bank preferences that are driving the choice of alliance form. So it's banks who are essentially getting to decide whether they take a minority or a majority stake, or whether they enter into a contractual product-based collaboration. But is that really right as an empirical matter, that it's banks who are exclusively driving the choice of alliance form? And I'm just not sure. But one suspects that if we assume alliances are indeed the result of mutually beneficial transactions between banks and fintechs, that there might be important fintech characteristics that help us to better understand the choice of alliance form. And here, I think, as with hypothesis one, it would be hugely helpful to have qualitative evidence to complement the quantitative evidence that's reported in this paper. And that might give us something, put flesh on the bones of our intuition that there's something else going on here. The results in relation to hypothesis three, again, I find extremely interesting and the most counterintuitive of all. It seems highly surprising to me that the public announcement of the FinTech Alliance does not have a positive impact on market value. And again, that makes me think that there must be something else going on. And I really wondered what your thoughts were on what else is going on here. The best guess I had was that the public announcement part of the sample is a subset of FinTech alliances overall in your sample. That is, that not all FinTech alliances that you observe are accompanied by a public announcement. So is there something different about those alliances that have to be announced publicly compared to other forms of alliance that might help us to better understand this? If there is something relevantly different about those particular type of alliances that have to be announced publicly to the market, then that might mean that it's not the case that all forms of FinTech alliance are not associated with a positive impact on market value. There might be something particular about the regulatory regime around what it is that exactly has to be announced that might help us to understand this. And then my final comment was the bigger picture. So as I understand it, during the sample period, this 20-year period that you construct, only 39% of all the banks in the sample engage in some form of alliance. And yet these are the 100 largest banks in the 4 jurisdictions that you survey. And again, this seems to me to be very surprising. The sample period is 2007 to 2017. Is it really the case that only 39% of these banks, the largest banks in each of these jurisdictions, have engaged in a FinTech alliance? And so I really wondered what your thoughts were on that and whether we might be missing something here, something that's not being captured by the project, some other form of arrangement which isn't captured by your measures of alliance. Because it seems to me unlikely that the remaining banks in the sample are doing everything exclusively on an in-house basis, given what we know from the literature about the limitations of banks in financial innovation. So thank you so much for the opportunity to comment on this paper, Lars.
Great, thank you, Kristin. And before we go to the Q&A, I just want to give Lars an opportunity to respond to some of the comments raised by Kristin. And then I already have 2 questions queued up, one by Gerhard Hertig and one by Georg Winger. Sorry, Lars, you're still muted. Give me a second. I will unmute you. There you go. Now it works.
Okay,
yeah, thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Kristin, for all of these comments, and I perfectly agree with all of them. So let me just briefly respond to a couple of them. So in terms of causality, I perfectly agree. This is not a causal analysis in terms of microeconometrics like you would like to see it, but I think this is the best we can do with the data, and I think it's still interesting to look what is going on. And we thought about even coming up with some stuff of sort of Granger causality, but then it wouldn't help a lot with causality because the thing is, you know, the overall corporate strategy, one might move first, the CDO or the digital strategy, the other one might move a bit later, but they are still influenced by the same thing, but we don't know what it is. And I perfectly agree. I mean, it could be something like this, an overall strategy. Having the fintech perspective, I think, is also interesting. I think we want to do this in a different paper. As it stands now, it doesn't make sense to combine all of this in one paper, but I think results might be completely different if we look from the fintech side, and qualitative research might make a lot of sense to see what is actually going on. With regard to the subset, or that we see this very few engagements, few in you might say it's few, but I also perfectly agree. I mean, this is everything we can see from the public, right? I mean, everything that banks in some form announce, and I perfectly agree that there might be more collaborations which we don't know about because the banks never announce it and it's just running in the background. And these forms of alliances might be more value relevant, I would say, than the ones we see over here. And in fact, announcing the alliance might be a way to just, pretend that you're doing something valuable, which it actually is not. And this is also why we see a negative effect for the event study in the end.